Okay, the record button should be going on. Matthias, you are letting people in. I'm going to let people get a minute or two before we get too crazy. But for those of you who are joining us, welcome to our special Monday edition of our Extension Hot Topics with the Ants of Indiana. We're going to let some folks get on. But as you're jumping on, as always, to our veterans, we are going to do a quick poll. So if you could do that one, that has showed up on your screen while we're waiting, we would greatly appreciate that for our numbers. We'll also send a couple new things. We're going to try to do post polls for everybody with that email that you will receive from Courtney after the presentation. And then a new thing we are trying today as well is putting this on as a Facebook Live. So if you're here in person, great. If you can't make it to us through your webinar or Zoom, we are making it available through either Miami County Extensions Facebook, Wabash County's Extensions Facebook, Howard County, and Cass County. So just another way to get our information out there. So that should be going live fairly quickly. And again, if you could just work on getting that poll done, we would greatly appreciate it. Webinar or Zoom, we are making it available through either, and again,
Sorry, we are live now on Facebook.
Okay, perfect. And now I can't see the poll. Did that go away or is it still up? Oh, what have I done?
It's still here, so.
Okay, perfect. Well, then I will go ahead and leave that. Let's see. But I think we're good with that. It's now noon. So again, if you're jumping on real quick, fill that out. We greatly appreciate it. And then we will move on. So I'm going to go ahead and end that poll and then we'll go ahead and get started. Courtney?
Okay, well, thanks for jumping on this bonus session of Purdue Extension Hot Topics. Today we have my friend Tabby Flinn. She is Vigo County's Ag and Natural Resources Extension Educator, and she is also the ant expert of the Midwest. She wrote her graduate school dissertation on ants of Indiana, and she is the go-to person for multiple states to identify your ants and ant questions. So we are excited to have her present this today. Tabby, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
All right. So like Courtney mentioned, my name is Tabby. I love insects. I'm an entomology major. And when I went into grad school, I knew I wanted to work on something that had to do with identification. And I knew I was going into the urban lab. And so the biggest group that I could work on would be ants, because there are so many different kinds of ants. Ants are in the family Hymenoptera, and they are Formica. So lots of our ant species have Formica as the first part, as their genus, but they're all Formicidae. Okay. So as an introduction, we're going to learn about ant classification. They are kingdom Animalia arthropods. They're insects, Hymenoptera. So they're related to bees and wasps and other stinging things. And yes, ants can sting. They are Formicidae. So all of our ants are lumped together in Formicidae. And there are over 11,000 species worldwide. And we're still finding new species. So tons and tons of ants around the world. When I started doing my research, I found, there's very little work that had been done on myrmecology, which is the study of ants here in the state of Indiana. So there was a potential for at least new species at the county and state levels, because we hadn't done a very good job of going all over the state to see where these ant species are. And I'm going to show you some maps here later that'll kind of make sense once you understand where the entomologists in the state are. They are becoming more and more of a pest species. So lots of ants, of all of the thousands of species of ants there are, not all of them are pests, but more learning to adapt to human environments and becoming pest species. And we needed a really accurate and up-to-date key so that we can identify these ants, because in order to control a colony of ants, you have to know what one they are, because different species of ants are going to act differently. And knowing the pest is half the battle. So we want to know what they are. As a pest, ants are the #1 urban pest. Many people would think cockroaches or bed bugs, which are slowly climbing up the ranks, but ants are the #1. Every year, it's about 1.7, probably closer to $2 billion in pest control alone for ants. We know of 41 different urban pest species in the United States, so there's a lot of potential for these guys to get into your house and into your structures and become a problem. They're not only structural pests, so they're also agricultural pests. They're pests of turf management. So if you think about golf courses and landscaping, they do lots of ornamental damage. So this picture here, these are the Allegheny mound ants. And as you can see, they do build mounds, and those mounds can get very, very large. So if you're looking to have a nice landscaped yard, they're probably not what you want living around. If it were my house, I would want to have these. I think they're super cool, but not a lot of people want giant ant nests in their yard. So why are they such a pest? They can feed on just about anything, and they have a huge amount of diversity and distribution across the world, so they can be everywhere. The only continent you're not going to find them on is Antarctica. They are large in number, so an ant colony, depending on the species, could be anywhere from 5 little ants to a couple thousand ants to a network of colonies that are working together. So they can become a very, very large problem. They are really good at adapting. So we talked about ants becoming new pests to people because they're learning to adapt and survive with the human environment. And they have this really great ability to fill tiny little niches. They're really small, so they don't eat a lot. And when they can find a food source and utilize the space, and that could be as simple as a wall void, they can become a really big problem. So some pest examples. One that I get the most calls about are carpenter ants. Everybody assumes that every black ant you find is a carpenter ant, but they're actually not. There's lots of species of carpenter ants, but the big black carpenter ants, those are the ones that people typically think of. There are 50 different species of carpenter ants in the United States, and in New York and Pennsylvania alone, they replace about 100 to 250 poles a year from carpenter ant damage. So this is even treated wood. Ants don't care. They're going to find a way to live in there. They're going to do some damage, and you're going to end up replacing poles and structural things and stuff like that. Argentine ants are another one. They're super aggressive. They displace native ant species. We talk about ants living in these big colonies that are networking together and working together. Argentine ants are an ant species that does that. And with them being aggressive and being able to sting, they are a nightmare of a pest to be getting like in and around your property. They can get in your honeybee hives. They will attack the main entrance and kill off as many bees as they can. And once they get there, they're just going to overwhelm the colony. So it's going to be hundreds of thousands of ants versus your maybe 3,000 bees that you have in your hive. So they can take over a honeybee colony and they can kill them, and they will eat all of that honey. Odorous house ants are another one. These are the main one that people find in their house. So this one's super cool in my opinion, because if you crush it, it smells like rotten coconut. So it's a pretty good telltale sign that that's what they are. They are really small, and to most people, it's a small black ant in the house. But if you do crush it, it's going to have that rotten coconut smell, which you're just going to have to smell it to believe me. They're a landscape pest. They're really opportunistic. So any rock or log or decorative planter you have, they're going to be living underneath that. They like to eat honeydew and proteins and fruits, so kind of a wide variety of things. And they're the #1 pest in kitchens and pantries. So that's where they like to hang out. So my objectives were pretty clear to me, at least. I wanted to update that checklist of Indiana ants. I wanted to find and record any new species in the state and the county. And I was really hoping to find a brand new species of ant. I was going to create a key that was both easy to use and accurate. So the first objective, updating that checklist, I needed to collect all the known data. So I went to the Smithsonian, I went to Harvard, I got to look at all of the behind the scenes action in their big giant insect collections and see what they had from the state of Indiana. And then locally, I went through Purdue's collection. The Indiana Natural History has a society has a collection. The Field Museum has one, Michigan State, Illinois State, Ohio State, Indiana University, Van Pelt, and the DNR. So all of these smaller collections that I also got to rifle through. And what was surprising was that even with these local collections that we had, there wasn't a ton of stuff from Indiana. So I went to the Smithsonian. It was super cool to get to see, you know, every university that has an entomology program has a small collection of insects you can go and look at. And theirs was just absolutely massive. So these doors that you see here are rolling doors. They have a little button to push left or right, and you can move that whole section. So it's a way to cram a whole bunch of insects into a small space. And then I collected data from private collectors. So Ed Wilson, he's also known as E.O. Wilson, was a very, very big name in the myrmecology world. And he helped me out, let me look through his collection, and also helped me a lot in my learning to identify different types of ants. Dan Kajar, Mike Sklavarla, and Kyle Schnepp. So those three guys are entomologists here in Indiana, or at least they were at the time, and they had pretty extensive insect collections. And then I went through the literature. So we could really only find one journal article, and it was from 1985. It was called The Checklist of Indiana Ants. They had 92 species listed. And I knew that couldn't possibly be the total number of species of ants in Indiana. And lo and behold, we came out to 136, but you'll see I have 137 listed there. Last year, we had a new record for the state. The Japanese needle ant is in the southern part of the state. So we now are up to 137. So once I did that, I put them into this giant rubric. It went by county because you're supposed to have your county information listed with every insect you collect. And so I listed out the counties and the different species that were found within the county. From there, I could determine how many different species were found in each county. And from that, I took, you know, species or counties that had no species recorded, which we know that can't possibly be true. There's going to be ants there. We had species less than 5 and less than 10. So as you can see down there on the bottom right, 3 counties had no species, 23 counties had less than 5, and 37 had less than 10. So we put that into a color-coded map. Here it is. You can see our 3 little red counties. Those are the ones with no insects. And you can see Tippecanoe County is the only one with 51 to 100 species. And the reason for that is that's where Purdue is. So that is where all of your entomologists are, and that county gets heavily collected in. You'll also notice some of the other areas, Brown County, Lawrence County, Crawford and Perry. Those are the Hoosier National Forest, Brown County area, and that is a very big collecting location for lots of entomologists here in the state. So 3 with none. We had our higher numbers around Tippecanoe and in the state forest areas. So now I'm going to find and record any new species at the county and state level. So how am I going to do that? Well, I had to get a permit. It's a little known fact. If you are an entomologist, you know it, but most people don't. You have to get a hunting license to collect insects in any national parks or state parks. And those are 2 different licenses. So I have to get a hunting license, and I wish I had a picture of it because I don't have it anymore, but it was a license to hunt insects, is what it said. And then I had to get a state permit to go into Hoosier National Forest. So my goal was to collect in all the counties that had less than or equal to 10 species, which was 67 counties. And I was going to use pitfall traps, and we'll see some examples, and 10-meter quadrants. So those quadrants, I would go out and measure a 10-meter square and go through everything that's in there. So go over it top to bottom, collect soil and leaf litter samples, and bring those back to see if there are any of our smaller ant species. So for collecting, this is what my office view looked like for about 3 years. I drove all over the state to collect these ants. I got to do a lot of camping. I chose to spend the majority of the time that I was out just camping, because as an entomologist, I love the outdoors. I'm going to get to see all kinds of stuff if I'm outside at night. So I camped almost every single night. So these are our pitfall traps. I was going to do 5 per county, but they kept getting tampered with. Raccoons, as it turns out, love to find anything you've put down on the ground and go wreck it. So I would set out these traps, and I would come back a week later and they'd be gone. So it was a ton of time and effort wasted that raccoons were getting in there. So underneath that board that you see there, there is a cup buried in the ground. That cup has alcohol, dish soap, and a piece of a banana in it, or a piece of tuna in it. It depended on which spot I was at in the county. And raccoons just kept digging them up. It was not being very efficient because I kept, losing them. And I was finding pretty much the same species by hand as I was with these pitfall traps. So I ended up not finishing out the pitfall traps for the rest of the state. Here's our 10-meter quadrants. I was doing 5 per county in 5 different habitats. So if we have forests, I want to go into the forest. I would like to get into an urban area. If there's a grasslands area, I'll do that. I did collect at a lot of cemeteries because that is a landscaped area that I can go poke around and nobody's going to come out wondering, what I'm doing out there. And then I go through that whole quadrant, look over everything, and take my soil and leaf litter samples back. So with the leaf litter samples, here's what you do. This is called a Berlese funnel. And you can see in those canisters, there is a light. So that's in the top tube. And then in the middle piece is where you put your sample. So you put your soil and leaf litter into that funnel. There are a number of screens underneath that that's going to help sort out some of the junk that'll be falling to the bottom. And then all the way in the bottom, little vials with alcohol. So essentially what this does is that light starts to heat up and dry the sample, and insects don't like that. So they're going to keep moving down and down and down until they fall into the alcohol. And then I can look and see what's in there. So where was I? I had 346 locations. This is the map of them. This is before Google Maps was a little easier to navigate, but I did have to go out and GPS locate every single one of my quadrants. And here's where I wound up collecting. So now I'm on to objective 2, which is to pin and identify all of these ants that I've collected. And it was thousands, like hundreds of thousands of ants. So that top picture is, that's a week of sampling. Those are little tiny vials. They've got ants in them. I have to take them all out of alcohol and either pin them or point them. So pointing is what you see a lot of in this box, where there's a tiny little piece of white. That white is a tiny little cardboard point. And what you have to do is use this little thing that looks like a hole punch, and you just punch out thousands and thousands of these little rect or triangle shaped points until your hand can't do it anymore. And then you pin all of those onto a pin, and then you painstakingly glue ants to the end of the point. And what this does is it means I don't have to destroy the insects, but it's also very time consuming. So then I'm going to take all of my ants after I've identified them and compare it to my historical records and see if we found any new ants for the state or the county. So once I got through all of that, and that was kind of what I did in the winter time. So I spent all spring, summer, fall, as long as the weather would allow, out collecting. And then I would spend the colder months or the rainy days pinning and identifying all of these ants. And from there, I was going to make a dichotomous key. So a dichotomous key is what you use to identify insects. So it'll give you is it this or is it this? And a lot of times they didn't have pictures or not very useful information. So we needed to make a really good key. So the current keys don't have a lot of pictures or didn't have a lot of pictures. And they were a little confusing because without pictures, a lot of these words that you're going to be reading, you have no idea what that is or where it even is on the ant. So we needed something that had a lot more pictures and with really good couplets. So not is it kind of like this or is it like that, but also a little bit like this? We needed very different structure to help identify. So here's a kind of an example of what we're looking at here. This is a Hypoponera ant, which doesn't mean a lot to most people. I think they're really cool, but they talk about the subpetiolar process. And if there was no A and B underneath that couplet, you'd have no idea what you were supposed to be looking for. Here's our bad couplet. Propodium evenly rounded in profile, dorsum and posterior face not strongly differentiated, surface generally glossy. Or is the propodium distinctly roundly angulate in profile, dorsum and declivity distinctly differentiated, and surface dull to glossy? a lot of word vomit right there and no pictures to help you identify, even get an idea of what you're looking for. So the propydium is the structure that's highlighted in blue here. And it's formed by the first abdominal segment and the thorax in ants and other Hymenoptera. So all bees and wasps, ants, they all have this structure. But if you don't give a picture to it to ever let a new entomologist figure out what they're looking for, they're never going to find it. So here's our evenly rounded propydium, and here's our roundly angulate. And you can see, even based on these pictures of actual ants, to the untrained eye, those might look like the same shape. So it can be a little confusing, which is why I did get to enlist the help of E.O. Wilson and other notable entomologists who could help me work through some of this. And I also, and I don't have it here, I went to look for it, I have a glossary of entomology terms, and it was very, very helpful in identifying our ants here. So what I was going to do for my key is I was going to draw all of the couplets and species profile images, which turned out to be a lot. So I also spent a good deal of my time drawing pictures, which was a lot of fun. So I was going to create a species profile so that every ant that was found in the state had a nice write-up that talked about where they were found in the state, what kinds of things they ate, how big their colonies are, if they're a pest, all that kind of good stuff. So it would have their taxonomy, key characteristics, where they are in the state, where they are in North America, any behavioral things that they might do, food preferences, what kind of habitat they live in, their nest location and structure, so where are they building these colonies, and any other interesting notes. So here's another drawing from one of my couplets. This is the apex of the gaster, which is the end of the ant abdomen. So sometimes ants have a stinger, sometimes they don't, but at the end of their gaster, which is the end of their abdomen, it can either be pointed like you see in photo A, or it can be like a round opening with hairs around it, as you see in photo B. So in A, those are the ants that sting, and in B, those are the ants that bite you and then use that opening to spray formic acid in. So either way, it's going to hurt. So I was going to obtain images of a printed specimen, outline the key characteristics of that specimen, trace it to transfer paper, burnish it to drawing paper, and then create the image. So here are two more examples of the drawings. In hindsight, I wish I could have used real photos of every ant. That would have been more useful than drawings of every ant, but at the time it was not something that my major professor thought feasible. So I went with drawings, which took way more time, I think. So here, this is what the picture looks like of an ant that you would find or that you've taken with your microscope. So we took a lot of the pictures ourselves. You outline all of the main characteristics and make sure you get those shapes correct. And then you can kind of manipulate that ant that's all crunched up on itself and put the legs in a proper position. So you just kind of make a good outline of it. And then you're going to transfer it to your drawing paper and finish any detail. So this is Proceratum selaceum. A lot of my favorite ants, and you're going to see some pictures later, are the super old genetically species of ants. So this is one of those. It's one of our very primitive ants. He's got super teeny tiny little eyes because they live underground. They don't need to see a lot. This is Stenema dickii. This one is really cool. They like to live inside acorns. So these are teeny tiny little ants, and their whole colony is going to be inside of a hollow acorn. This is Camponotus subarbatus. This is another carpenter ant. So any ant species that starts with Camponotus as the genus is a carpenter ant. These ones I think are cool because they're like super dark black, and then they have a white membrane between their abdominal segments, and you can always see it. And this is Chromatogaster cerassi. These are our acrobat ants, and we'll see some pictures of these guys here in a little bit. So by updating the known distribution and diversity of our ants here in Indiana, I was hoping to be able to create this key for identification that would be really easy to use and useful in the information it provided. So something that could be useful for pest control providers throughout the state. So I did wind up making a key that has all of the ants in it. And then I also made another key that was specific to the ones that were known pests. So providers can use that short key. That's usually going to get them to where they need to go. And if they can't get it that way, they can either contact me or they can go through the bigger key. So these are some of my fun summertime numbers. I got stung exactly one time, and it was on my eyelid, which is not great. And my eye did swell all the way shut. It was pretty terrible. I had car trouble twice. That is the oil that is no longer inside my car because the drain plug fell out. And this is why you always pay attention to where you park, because I parked next to that and then I backed up and drove straight into it. There were some very, very kind, helpful miners who came and pushed my car out of that hole for me. Otherwise, I probably never would have gotten out of there. I had ants in my pants exactly 4 times, and I could do without that happening again. And I saved a turtle from the road 27 times. So even when you're out collecting ants, you can still help a turtle get across the road. I pulled a tick off of myself 52 times. That's a lot of ticks. And I saw 53 purple traps. So this is a purple trap. They were at the time, I think they're still being used, but not as heavily as they had in the past. They were monitoring for emerald ash borer across the state. So these purple traps are what they use to monitor for those emerald ash borers. I visited a gas station over 100 times. I lost count, and I drove 14,554 miles. Got to see lots of different gas stations. My poor car, she was great. She did great through the whole thing with the exception of, the oil plug. That was quite the incident. And it was all in the name of science. So you get to do lots of really cool things when you're a science major, especially a biology science major, because you get to do a lot of it outside. So now we're going to talk about Indiana's coolest ants, or at least the ones that I think are Indiana's coolest ants. This is Stigmatoma palepes. This is the oldest species of ant we have here in Indiana. You can see, I showed you the picture of the other Stenema earlier who had very small pupils. You can't even see the eyes on this ant. So a lot of our primitive ant species have less than 6 facets to their eye. So we'll see some other ants here in later pictures that have very large eyes, and they're above ground and they need to be able to see lots of things. But a lot of our primitive ants don't have big eyes or have just a single facet to their eye because they didn't need to see very well. They were underground. This is Hypoponera opaciceps. This is another super primitive one, and I only found them 3 times. But I think they're super cool. Another primitive ant with very small eyes. These are the ones that I think are so cool because they're so teeny, teeny, tiny, and they live in the woods undisturbed. And so to be able to find them and get to look at them and see their behavior in the wild, I think is super cool. Another super primitive ant, this is Ponera pennsylvanica. This guy, super, super teeny, tiny eyes. This is a close up with my favorite ant. I love them. I think they're super cool looking. I love the shape of their body. I love their little secretive behaviors. Their colonies are less than 10 ants. So they're really, really small little colonies. I was not able to find an entire colony, which I really hoped to do. And every time I found one of these guys out foraging, I would follow them for hours in hopes that I was going to get to see them go home, and never got the chance to. So I was never able to find a full colony. This is Proceratum selacium. It's another primitive ant. These were some of the first ants to develop a really painful sting. And this is a reproductive ant. So she still has her wings. Once they mate, ants will tear off the wings. So the male will mate the female. He'll rip her wings off so she can't fly off and find another male to mate, ensuring his genetics continue on. So all reproductive ants have wings. And then after they mate, they lose their wings. This is Solenopsis molesta. If you've heard anybody in the South talk about fire ants, Solenopsis is the genus for fire ants. So this is a fun fact, Indiana's only fire ant, and they live underground and they want nothing to do with you. And even if you were to find them, their stingers are so small they can't pierce your skin. So when people complain about fire ants and they tell you, oh, you don't have to worry about fire ants in Indiana. Oh, we have them. They're just not dangerous. They're cute and tiny and they live underground and they feed on the honeydew of these root aphids, which you can see in that photo there. This is Lasius claviger. This is another subterranean ant, so they live in the ground as well. But these guys are not as old as some of those other species I was showing you. They just evolved to live underground, so they were an above ground species that learned to live underground. They are this crazy orange color in real life. So if you happen to dig up a plant or move a log or something and you find these ants, they are that color. And what's really cool about them is we call them citronella ants. And it's not just because of their color, but if you happen to find a nest, it smells like citronella. So you can smell them. You don't even have to crush one to smell it, but you can smell the colony and know that that's what they are, which I think is cool. And most entomologists think is cool, but most common people are like, ew, why are you smelling ants? This is Formica exsectoides. This is unfortunately not a real photo, but they do make these massive mounds. And so this is also from that earlier photo of the big mounds in the yard. These are much larger. These were about 3 feet tall. When I talked about getting ants in my pants, twice it was these ants, because they have ants patrolling around that property. So they're not just up hanging out in the nest, they are actively out in the grass patrolling the area. And without fail, they will find you if you get too close and they will start biting you. So we talked about ants with stingers. These ants don't have a stinger. They have that round opening on the end of their gaster. And what they're going to do is bite you really aggressively until they've broken skin. And then they curl their abdomen up underneath and they spray formic acid into the wound. So it burns just as it would if you'd been stung. So they're getting the formic acid into you anyway, just a different method, but I think they're really cool. We did bring a nest of these back to the office. We had them in the lab and they were the craziest aggressive ants we had in the entire lab. So I dropped tweezers in there one time and I couldn't get them out for 2 days. Like they won't let go of stuff. They all, as soon as something weird happens around their nest, they all attack it, which is really crazy. This is Aphenogaster tenensis. These guys like to live in rotting logs. And I think that they're super cool because of the color that they are. They're like a bright red color. Most Aphenogaster ants are very, very hairy. This is the only species that isn't very hairy. And so they're very shiny. So I can see them. If I flip over a log and I disturb a nest, all I have to do is see those shiny abdomens and I know exactly what they are. There are no other ants in the state that don't have any hairs on their abdomen. So I think they're really cool. This is Brachymyrmex dipilus. These are the smallest ants in the state. So they're super, super teeny tiny. They live underground. You can see this paler colored one down in the middle of the photo. So that's a new baby. She just hatched out. She has not gotten color on her exoskeleton yet, so she's still very soft. There's one in the front of the photo also with wings. So this colony is getting ready to have a nuptial flight, which is what ants do. So when they have a nuptial flight, the queen's gonna lay a lot of male and female reproductive eggs. They're all gonna hatch out kind of close at the same time and they wait in the nest for a cue. So that cue is usually a weather event. With a lot of our subterranean ants, it's a heavy rainstorm. So they will wait for a heavy rainstorm. That means the ground's gonna be soft. They will all emerge, they'll mate, and new queens can dig a burrow. So they wait for that rain so that the ground is soft. This is Camponotus castaneus. This is my favorite carpenter ant because he doesn't look like a carpenter ant. I should mention. All ants are shes unless they're a reproductive male. So just like your honeybees where the whole colony is female, same applies for ant colonies. There are very, very few males in there, if at all. Really the only time you find males in the colony is when they're getting ready to have a mating swarm or a nuptial flight. So you're not going to find male ants. They're all going to be females. But this specific carpenter ant I think is super cool because it's orange, and almost all of our carpenter ants in Indiana are black. So it's really cool to see an orange one. We also have a Camponotus americanus, which is an orange and black carpenter ant. So it's my Halloween ant. This is Colobopsis impressa, and these are known as reed ants. They are super, super cool in that they use their face as a door. So you can see he's got like a little flat spot. I keep misgendering my ant. So this ant's got a little flat spot on the front here. What she's gonna do is they live in reeds, so like reed grass down by the water, and they chew a little hole, and then the whole colony is inside that reed. And what this ant's gonna do is if something threatens the nest, or if it's raining or it's windy, or they just don't want whatever's going on outside to come in, she'll use that round flat spot on her face and push it up against the edge of the reed, and nothing can go in or out. So it's really cool to see. I did get to witness it. I did follow some of these ants home and found their little house. And then I took a piece of grass and kind of pushed it around at the entrance. And sure enough, one comes up and blocks the door. So it's really, really cool. These are Chromatogaster laeviescula. So this is another acrobat ant. We call them acrobat ants because they like to hold their abdomens up in the air. So you can see they kind of have this pointed or heart-shaped abdomen. And when they feel threatened, because they have stingers, they will hold their butts up in the air. So they'll hold their abdomen up in the air. So they're running around like little circus performers with their tail end up, just waiting for your hand to get close enough so that they can sting it. And a lot of times these are the ants that you find, if you're out moving lumber. I find them in my shed often enough. They don't like to destroy wood, but they like to live between layers. So if I've had plywood or something stacked out in the shed for too long, I can find in between. And a lot of times they will sting you before you realize there are ants on you, because they're very small and they're all going to start stinging at once. So all of a sudden you're like, gosh, my hand is on fire. And you look down, you're just being stung by ants. So they're really cool. They also have these cool little spines on their backs, and you can see it in some of them. These are little guard spines. So I just think acrobat ants are really, really cool. This is Dorymyrmex elegans, also known as the elegant ant or the long-legged ant. So it's obviously elegans because it's a very elegant, long, dainty-legged ant. But they live in sandy areas. So you can find them up at the Indiana dunes. You can find them some around the Kankakee Sands area, but they run across the sand super quick. The reason their legs are so long is to keep their body away from hot sand. So if they're living in sand and the temperature gets too hot, they're just gonna stilt on their little legs and run across the sand really quick. This is Myrmica spatulata. I like this one because of its name, but also it's a really common ant to find in your backyard. So if you happen to live in an area that might flood, just like a low standing spot of water, and you have these ants, they do something called rafting. So their colonies are never usually more than about 100 ants, and they're kind of small. So if it gets too wet and their little colony structure starts to flood, they will take the queen and the eggs and lift her up, and she will be sitting on top of this raft of ants who are all holding on to each other. And then they just kind of float around until the water goes down. So I think they're cool in that aspect. My parents' house is on a lake, and so the backyard floods sometimes. And I always thought it was super cool to go out and you could count how many little Myrmica colonies were in the backyard because of this really cool thing that they do. This is Strumigenes rostrata, or the sponge ant. So you can see on her abdomen, she's got these little spongy appendages. Nobody has yet to figure out the purpose of that spongy tissue. This is the only genus of ants with that kind of tissue, and we're still kind of doing research to see why they have this. Is it something left over evolutionarily? Is it something they're developing evolutionarily? What's the purpose of it? It's like, we don't know. It's one of the ant world's biggest mysteries. So we're still trying to figure that out. But also the hairs on the rest of their body are like tiny little loops. So you can kind of see it on the face. Their hairs are rounded on the ends. So they just look super cool. They're a really primitive ant. You can see the mouth parts there face forward. Most ant mouth parts point down. So this is a very unique species for the state. This is Phydolia dentata. They're known as big-headed ants. And you can see the size discrepancy as well as the head size discrepancy in these individuals in this photo. So big-headed ants are common across the state. We have about 12 species of Phydolia ants here in Indiana, and they all have these, they call them majors and minors. So you have majors, which are this big girl here, and the minors are the smaller ones. The majors keep everybody safe. So a lot of times you will see them, it always looks like they're not doing work. They're riding around on whatever food the minors are picking up and bringing back. And they're actually just keeping watch for birds or other predators that will come down and snack on an ant. But a lot of times it looks like they're just riding high on their cracker, going back to the nest because they don't have to do any of the heavy lifting. And then one of the coolest species for the state, I say that about every ant because I think they're all really cool. This is Trachymyrmex septentrionalis, which is our only species of leafcutter ant here in the state. They are only found in the very southwest corner of Indiana, down by the Evansville area, and they do cut leaves and move them. So this is the southern leafcutter ant in the United States, and the south part of Indiana is the very northernmost tip of their distribution in the United States. So we can find them. We don't find them very often. I did find a colony down there. I think they're really, really cool. Fun fact about leafcutter ants, they're not eating that leaf that they're taking back. They're using it to farm. So they are actually going to go back and feed that to the fungus that they're growing, and they're going to eat the fungus. So when people talk about farming, I always like to mention, oh, ants have been farming way longer than people. So we have our leafcutter ants farming a fungus. A lot of our soil-dwelling ants, like our native fire ant and the Brachypyrmex species, that little guy, and the citronella ants, they farm root aphids. So they're keeping that colony alive because they like to eat the honeydew or the poop of the aphids. So they're keeping them safe. If you have a vegetable garden and you start noticing ants running up and down the stems of your plants, they're guarding an aphid colony. So you have an aphid problem in your garden. So ants they've been farming way longer than people have been farming. This is Tetramorium seispidum. This is the pavement ant. So they're called pavement ants because you almost always see them around pavement. They like to live under sidewalks, under paver stones, and they don't like neighbors. So what they're going to do is if a scout comes back and reports, oh my gosh, I found another carpenter or another pavement ant colony, 2 blocks down the sidewalk, they're all going to leave the nest and go fight. So you can find hundreds of thousands of ants from 2 different colonies battling it out on the pavement to see who gets to stay. And it's not okay, we give up, like we'll move. They're going to kill them all. So the ants are going to battle to the death. A lot of times people will either call me because they're seeing it happen, or they will call me because they see the aftermath, which is just, hundreds of thousands of dead ants on the sidewalk. So they're not super dangerous to people. A really cool aspect to our pavement ants is that they have a little appendage on the tip of their stinger. It's a little triangle piece. And so when they sting, that little triangle piece breaks off in the skin and it's irritating. So they can sting people. I've been stung by them a handful of times. They're not very good at it. Our skin's a little too thick, but they can sting people. And when they do, it does burn for a significantly longer time than any other kind of sting because that little piece is in your skin and it has to break down. So fun fact about our little pavement ants. And this is Temnothorax curvispinosus. They live in acorns. So we talked about another acorn species earlier, but this is a different one. They're usually less than 75 ants in this colony. And what they do is they reuse acorns that weevils have been in. So if you're familiar with weevil, it's a little beetle. and the acorn weevil lays its eggs on acorns. So what the acorn weevil does is it chews a hole. They're also called snout beetles because they have long noses. So she's going to chew a hole through that acorn at the top and lay an egg in there. The egg's going to hatch. The weevil larva is going to eat a whole bunch of the acorn, and then it's going to chew its way out. So with a new hole. So you'll have one hole for when it was laid and another one where it comes out. Perfect for ants that are super teeny tiny. So what they're going to do is go in and finish hollowing out that acorn, and then they're going to live in there. So I didn't take this picture. I would never knowingly destroy a little house of ants. But I did find several colonies. We brought them back to the lab. They're just super cool to watch, to see them going in and out of that acorn. And you just kind of have to wonder how many little ants are in there. Super cool. This is Cinema dickey. Again, different little ant here. This is another acorn species. I like that they have two parts to their petiole. So the petiole is the waist of our ants. And you can see here, this one's got a petiole right there and a post petiole, which is that second little part behind it. So not a lot of ants have a petiole and a post petiole, but Cinema dickey does, and they're both very long on this ant. So I think they're really, really cool.
Hey, Tabby,
Yes.
we've got a question in the chat on pavement ants. How do they know which ants are from the enemy colony?
So they actually release pheromones, and ants use their antenna to smell, essentially. So they're releasing pheromones. They know what their own colony smells like, and they know what an ant from a different colony, or an ant that's not from their colony, is going to smell different. So they're going to find that ant, and then they're going to go report back. We've got neighbors, and I don't like them. And then they're going to go battle out on the pavement. It's a very good question. This is Polyergus montevegus. They are also known as the slave-making ant. So you can see in this picture, we've got two different colored ants. The Polyergus is the red or rusty colored ant there, and they will actively go out and hunt for formica nests. So those black ants you see there, not carpenter ants, they're formica ants. So they live in the ground. Our formica ants are what we call field ants. So they're a larger species of ground dwelling ant. They build smaller kind of dome structures. They're not usually super big unless they're that mound builder ant. But what these Polyergus ants do, they go out, they find a nest, and they raid it. So an ant will go out, find that nest, go back and report that it found a nest. The whole colony is going to leave and go to the new nest, or the nest that they found, and they're going to collect as many workers and larvae as they can, and then they're going to bring them back. And they can do this because they produce very similar smelling pheromones as the formica ants do, and they can kind of trick them into doing whatever they want. So they bring all these ants back. Those formica ants are the ones who do all of the food collecting, do all of the maintenance of the colony. Like, they're doing all the work, and the Polyergus ants aren't doing anything other than getting fed, and the queen's laying eggs. They are really, really cool. You can find them a lot in more of a forested area. So they're going to raid out into open landscaping areas looking for these formica ants. They'll bring them back into the woods, and it's really quite the sight to see. You're walking down a trail and you just see hundreds of ants streaming past you, and you can follow them back and find out where the Polyergus colony is, and then you can follow them the other way and find out where the formica nest is that they're raiding. And it's just crazy to watch them just walk right into the other nest undetected, nobody cares, and carry out another fully grown ant and just take it back home. It's crazy. And we have our not really ants, but they're really cool. These are velvet ants. We have 6 species of velvet ants here in Indiana. Most of ours look like the top 2 left photos. They're usually red and black, sometimes red and white. We don't really have any of the white and black ones here in Indiana. The reason I say not really ants is because velvet ants are actually a wingless wasp. So these are all females walking around on the ground, and the males have wings, and they're going to fly down and mate the female, and then they leave. They are the most painful sting out of any insect here in Indiana. So it's not just gonna hurt on the location of the sting, it's gonna like shooting pain. My husband stepped on one a couple years ago in the backyard. He didn't even step on it. It got like into his sandal and stung him. He had to sit down. It hurt pretty bad. And he said the pain was shooting up his leg. I got stung once when I was little, and I remember that being really terrible. But they are super cool. There was a grad student doing research on them, and they ended up switching to a different topic because when they were asked, well, why don't you want to work on velvet ants anymore? They said there's no rhyme or reason to anything that they do. I followed ants around in the forest for months. There's no rhyme or reason to where they're going. They don't have a home site. They just lay eggs wherever they want. The male just like randomly comes down and mates with a female. There's no planning on anybody's part for anything that these velvet ants are up to. So he switched his dissertation. He wasn't going to do velvet ants anymore. Then we have other non-ant things that you can find in ant colonies. This is a antennomorphous mite. We call them antennomorphous because they do typically hang out around the face, around the antenna. So you can see this is a formica ant. We've got very large eyes. They're above ground. They need to be able to see really well. And then you've got this little mite that just hangs out and steals food from the mouth of that ant before it can even eat it. And the ant somehow has no idea this giant mite is just hanging out on its face. We have a number of ant nest beetles. These guys produce the exact same pheromones as ants, or they're incredibly good at mimicking that pheromone, and they live in the ant colony. They do occasionally eat pupa, but usually they're eating any dead ants, or they're helping, clean up the colony so the ants don't mind so much if they notice there's a bigger, weird looking ant walking around in the colony. But they do have these crazy looking antennas, and those antennas are for releasing the ant pheromone. So that's an evolutionary trait that they've developed. And we have rove beetles that mimic ants. Rove beetles eat a lot of other insects. So they're eating the ants and going undetected while they do it. There are lots of different kinds of them. They're kind of hard to notice unless they're a different color than the ants in the colony. There were a handful of times that I brought back samples and I had them in there because I didn't realize I'd picked up, a rove beetle instead of an ant. And we also have lots of ant mimicking spiders. These guys hang out around ant colonies or on leaves and branches that they know that ants are traveling to. Maybe there's aphids there. And if you think about the anatomy of insects versus spiders, so insects have 3 sets of legs and spiders have 4. So how are we gonna make an ant think that I'm an ant if I have, 1 more set of legs than everybody else? They hold that 4th set out in front of them like it's their antenna, and they just walk around waving them like crazy, and they look like an ant. So that I will take any questions that anybody has about ants. And I welcome questions because I love ants.
I have a question, Tabby. I've got a homeowner who has an ant colony in their kids' sandbox, and they obviously want to move those ants out of the sandbox for the kid. What's your advice for that?
So the best advice is to find out what kind of ant it is. Sometimes they're living there because they like the environment. So if you can find out what kind of ant they are, you can kind of understand their behavior a little bit better. They might be living in the wood, or is it a wooden sandbox? I should have asked that, I guess.
I believe so.
Yeah, so a lot of times ants will get into the cracks of the wood. So if that's where they're coming from, you might just try sealing any cracks. Let's see, someone asked how they can prevent ants from coming in every year. A really, really good solution for ants is something that's called home defense. And there are lots of different brands that make it, and it's a spray insecticide, and it lasts for a year. So once a year, you take this spray out and you go around the base, like the foundation of your house. Don't spray the soil, but spray the actual, bottom of your house all the way around. And ants, they're either going to walk into it and walk back out of it, or they're going to go into it and die. You can also buy diatomaceous earth, and it's kind of the same concept. You just sprinkle it around the base of your house. And that one is full of tiny, tiny little microscopic bits of seashells and stuff that's going to scratch the exoskeleton of the ants. And once they get these scratches, they kind of dehydrate to death because they can't keep the moisture in. Another question, is it okay that we're killing the ants that get into our house? Absolutely. I love ants, but I don't want them in my house. And if I find them in the kitchen, we're going to have a problem. So yeah, it's totally fine. And a lot of the ones you're finding in your house are found across the state and in great numbers. So it's not a problem. Are ants active in the winter? What time do they start getting more active in the spring? They are not really active in the winter unless they're living in your walls or in your kitchen or something like that. They go into kind of a state of dormancy, hibernation. They can freeze almost completely solid and then thaw back out. So they're not active right now. And usually about the time in spring when we're starting to get 40-degree days, that's about the beginning of insects waking up. So 40 degrees and warmer, they're going to start becoming more active. Like I mentioned earlier with the citronella ants and other ground dwelling ants, when those spring rains start happening is when you're going to start seeing a lot of mating swarms or nuptial flights. So you can find lots of ants flying around. When did I write a book? It's right here. My thesis is it's like 395 pages long. So I do have a book filled with ants and all the ant knowledge that I've gained. And I talked about distribution maps. So you can see here, this is for an Aphenogaster ant, I believe. Yes. And you can see on the map, grayed out, the green squares are the counties in which that ant was found. So there are some ants where you find sporadic stuff like that. And then there are other ants like the big black carpenter ant that is just every county we found him in. There is not really a deterrent that won't kill ants, but a really fun fact about ants is if you have a blue or black ball pen, and it has to be, no, Bic, it's a Bic pen. It has to be the brand Bic. The chemicals used to make that color ink for Bic specifically is the exact same chemical as one of their trailing pheromones. All ants use it. So you can take that pen and you can draw a line and the ants will follow the line. You can draw a circle and they will walk around that circle forever because they're following a trailing pheromone. But no, we don't really have deterrents that won't kill the ants. Can we get the key determined pests from beneficial ants? I can send out a PDF of the pest species of ants. To my knowledge, the only place you can find the full key is in my thesis. But if you're super interested in that, I can get you a copy of my key. What is the effective way to rid ants that are mining under a driveway and emerging from the cracks? So those are probably pavement ants. And you can use any kind of taro spray. Baits typically don't work the best on outdoor ants because there's so much other food around, they're not going to go looking for it. But you can use any kind of insect spray that you have at home should work, and you just spray it down in the crack. And then if you don't want them to continue coming back, you'll have to fill that crack. Another ant that lives in cracks and pavement and stuff like that is, well, are the Lasius genus of ants, which are just real small. A lot of people call them piss ants. They're kind of yellow-brown, not very notable in any other aspect, but they do build lots of tiny little nests. How do all these different types get started in a county? I'm not exactly sure what you're asking there, Martin. The best way to get rid of carpenter ants is to find out where their nest is. If they are in your house in large numbers, that means there's a nest somewhere in your house. So in order for them to build a nest, they need a wooden structure that is damp. So that could indicate that you have a water leak somewhere. and it's, giving them an opportunity with a rotten piece of wood somewhere. If you're finding just one or two, which we find in our house, usually late summer when we're kind of dry, they're always in our bathroom looking for water, and we know which tree they're coming out of, but it's just weird. We still don't even know how they're getting in, but every once in a while we'll find one in the bathroom. But the best way to get rid of them is to find the nest, and then you can use an ant specific insecticide. They even make stuff specifically for carpenter ants. Oh, they're in the porch or on the porch. If you just don't want them coming up on the porch, you could use that home defense spray, and you just spray around the base of the whole porch, and that'll keep them out. Any other questions?
Do you have a go-to publication for ants and ant management that you think is better than some others?
I do, and I can also send out that PDF.
I think maybe Martin was wondering how the different types of ants get to where they are living now.
Okay, so the only time ants are going to move is if their nest has been destroyed, or if they recently had enough flight and we've got new queen ants. So if you find an ant nest and you destroy it, you didn't kill the ants. They just picked it up and moved it somewhere else, so you have to find it again. But the majority of the spread happens through those nuptial flights. So if you think about it, like we've got one colony here and it has a mating swarm, and then we get 5 more colonies, they're going to be spread out from that one, and they're just going to keep reaching and branching. So they'll just keep moving, kind of slowly expanding their range. With our invasive ants, they typically get brought in houseplants. So you buy a new plant from a big box store and you bring it home and you take it out of the container and you plant it in the ground. There could have been ants in there. And that is the number one way that we get most of our invasive species, is through purchasing trees, lumber, plants for your garden. That's how they're getting in here. So the new species that we found in the state, when I talked about the Ponera ant, it's in the same genus as the Ponera ant. It looks very similar. So it could have been here, for a long time. We just didn't know it because there's no entomologist down in the southern part of the state looking for the species. So that one started in the south and is moving north, and I believe it can go all the way up the state. It's not one of great concern. Right now, it's not displacing too many other native species. It just has a really bad sting. Is the home defense harmful to people that are spraying it? Any precautions when you apply? So always, always, always read and abide by the label on your pesticides. That label is the law. So read through it. It's probably got, pants, long sleeve shirt, closed-toed shoes, gloves, glasses, and then you should be fine. Once that stuff is sprayed and dried, you don't need to be too concerned about it. Just don't, if you've got kids, tell them not to touch the wall or anything like that where you've sprayed it.
Tabby, I think people want you to write a book with pictures.
I can make another book with pictures. That's not my thesis. That'd be a little more exciting to read probably than my thesis.
I think it's a good idea. I would read it, Tabby. Well, if we have no more questions, you guys will get the follow-up email from me with the resources. Tabby, you'll send me the PDFs that she was talking about, and I will get them out to you. And we just appreciate, Tabby, you coming on and sharing your love of ants. It's always fascinating every time. She's my go-to entomologist for when I have questions, and she's always got something fascinating to share about insects. So we really appreciate your time and taking this little bonus session on Monday. We'll be back next month at our regular time, Wednesday, with Austin Pearson and the Midwest Regional Climate Center. I hope that I got that correct. So it was great, and thank you so much.